That cold morning on the outskirts of Georgia, the field behind the small wooden house lifted a thin mist that clung to the fence posts and the low shrubs that lined the pasture. The ground still held last night's rain and smelled of clay and grass and pine. Margaret stood on the porch with a cup that had long since gone cool and watched the pale sky gain color by careful degrees. The boards beneath her feet were smooth from years of sweeping, and the hinges of the screen door whispered when the wind touched them. She breathed in the quiet and felt the weight of another day settle into place. In that quiet, there was room for memory, and there was room for work, and both had become the way she kept her balance. Time had arranged itself around her after Daniel's passing, not with drama, but with steady repetition that kept the days from breaking. She would wash a plate that did not need washing, fold a cloth that was already folded, check a latch, count the jars in the pantry, and listen to the soft click of the kitchen clock. The work was small and faithful, and in the quiet of it she could feel the shape of what had been lost without dropping it. On the mantel above the cold hearth, Daniel's photograph held the afternoon light in a way that made his eyes seem steady and kind. She had learned to meet that gaze and let it pass through her like a prayer. Some days the prayer felt strong, some days it felt thin as thread. The rain had softened the soil along the fence, so she pulled on her gloves and decided to tend the patch where weeds always returned first. She did not hurry. On this land, it was better to walk with patience and let the mind find its pace. The path from the porch to the far corner curved past the shed where Daniel used to keep his tools arranged with a care that bordered on devotion. The door sagged now, and a swallow had made a home in the eaves. She paused to listen, then continued toward the narrow strip of ground near the pasture gate where grass never thickened the way it should. That strip had bothered her before, though she could not have said why. It was not a trend of soil or a trick of shade. It was a feeling the eye returned to in the way the heart returns to a half-remembered tune. She pressed the toe of her boot into the dirt and felt it give more than the surrounding ground. Something had disturbed it, and not long ago. A season earlier, she had told herself that Daniel had buried scraps from a repair or redirected a small flow of water after a storm. She had not asked many questions then, because trust was the language of their home, and trust does not keep a ledger. She went to the shed and found the small hand shovel with the smooth handle, worn by years of work. The tool felt honest in her palm. She knelt beside the dark patch and sank the blade into the loosened soil. The earth yielded in neat slices. Damp clay gathered along the edges, and cool air rose from the small cut in the ground. She lifted one layer and then another, steady and careful, the way her mother had taught her to peel apples without breaking the curl of skin. The morning was quiet. No engine hummed on the road. No voice called from the fence line. There was only the soft sound of the shovel and the slow rhythm of her breath. After several careful turns of the shovel, the blade met something that was not earth. The sound was small but sure, a tap that carried a new note through the soil. Margaret brushed the hole with her fingers until a corner of wood appeared. The grain was rough and dark from time in the ground. She widened the space, slid her hands along the sides, and lifted the object free. It was a wooden box. Not large, but weighted, with a metal hasp at the front. Mud clung to it and left streaks across her gloves. She stood and felt the change inside the morning. The wind shifted slightly. The sparrow quieted in the eaves. A day that had begun with chores had stepped into something else. She wiped the box with the corner of her apron until the wood showed its nicks and scratches. Each mark suggested a past use that had nothing to do with secrets, which made its present purpose feel even heavier. The hasp resisted at first, but gave way with a brittle snap that reminded her of dry twigs after a frost. Inside lay a folded piece of cloth that had yellowed with years. The fabric released a faint scent of cedar and oil, as if it had slept near tools. She unfolded it with care and found a metal container the size of a small book, its surface dulled by time and its edges scarred by a life that had not been soft. She turned the container in her hands and saw that a name had been engraved with tidy strokes that had outlasted weather and time. She did not expect to see her husband's name there, yet there it was, plain and certain. Daniel Miller. The sight pulled the air from her chest and left a space that was not panic and not calm, only a kind of solemn clarity. This had been put in the ground by a choice, not by accident. She carried the container into the kitchen where the light fell evenly across the table and where the clock could keep her company. She washed her hands, dried them carefully, and sat with her back straight and her feet steady on the floor. The lid did not slide at first. She pressed at the seam with patience learned from mending stubborn seams and from years of waiting for bread to rise. The seal loosened and the top lifted. Inside lay a folded paper and a small leather pouch tied with string. The paper felt brittle, but it held when she opened it flat upon the table. The handwriting that reached her eyes was firm and familiar. It leaned forward with the same measured slant that had filled their ledgers and labels for seed jars. Her name sat at the top of the page, and below it came lines that moved with a careful rhythm that belonged to a man who had built his life on steadiness. She read the opening line and paused to steady herself. The words said that if this letter had reached her hands, time had prevented a spoken confession. The sentences moved with a rhythm she recognized from the man who had always measured twice before he cut lumber, and who had always checked the gate twice before he turned in for the night. The letter did not chase excuse. It asked her to protect herself if anyone came searching for what had been hidden. It did not name anyone in that first part. It did not describe every step. It stood inside the border between what a person can say plainly and what a person can only set down and hope will be understood. She folded the letter and set it beside the container. The small pouch waited with its string knotted in a simple square. She loosened it and tipped the contents into her palm. Her pocket watch slid into her hand with a weight that surprised her. The case was tarnished, and yet even under the tarnish, the craft showed itself in gentle curves and a hinge that still moved with quiet certainty. She turned it over and found an engraving. The letters were small and careful, and they formed a name that was not her husband's name. The name was Edward Collins, and it came to the kitchen like a stranger who refused to step back from the threshold. She pressed the crown and the face opened. The hands were stopped at a little past 7. The glass bore a faint scratch across its surface. She closed it and set it on a folded cloth so the metal would not mark the table. Then she returned to the letter and found a second page tucked behind the first. This page held more detail. It spoke of a workshop beyond town, where wood dust hung in the air like morning fog, and where orders had come faster than 2 men could manage, without long nights. It spoke of an error in measurement that cost money and time and pride, and of tempers that rose and then cooled without making peace. It spoke of a night when a small fire found fuel and grew before anyone could bring water fast enough. Margaret laid both pages flat and studied the places where the pen pressed harder near the end. The last lines asked for forgiveness without asking for forgetfulness, and that difference settled in her chest with quiet force. She gathered the letter and the watch and returned them to the container, then placed the container inside the wooden box. She carried it to her bedroom and set it in the cedar chest that held quilts and family papers. The house kept its slow rhythm around her, while the field held its own steady breath and waited. The morning after the discovery rose grey and damp, with a thin fog clinging low over the field like a sheet that refused to lift. Margaret stood by the kitchen window and watched the slow drift of mist across the pasture. The house behind her felt unchanged, yet nothing in it seemed to belong to the world that existed the day before. On the table near the window, the wooden box rested where she had left it, its edges clean now, its weight still unspoken. The letter lay folded beside it, the faint smell of soil still rising from the pages. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat without drinking it. The ticking of the clock carried across the room with the kind of patience that only time understands. She looked at the box and thought of Daniel's hands, the way they had always known how to mend what others would throw away. He had been a man who fixed things quietly, whether they were broken chairs or small disappointments. The thought that he might have hidden something troubled her more deeply than she expected. Outside, the first light of the sun began to pierce through the fog. The fence glistened with dew, and the trees near the edge of the field stood dark and motionless. Margaret lifted the letter once more, running her thumb along the crease. The handwriting seemed almost alive under her fingers. She read the lines again and again, trying to find what was not said between them. The words felt careful, restrained, as though Daniel had written them knowing that they would wound. There was tenderness in his tone, but also guilt, and beneath it all something like fear. If they ever come looking for it, don't tell them you found this. The sentence returned to her mind like a song she could not forget. She read it aloud once, her voice quiet, as if testing the sound of it in the air. Then she folded the page again and held it close for a moment before setting it down. Her thoughts wandered to the name engraved on the watch. Edward Collins. The name did not belong to anyone she knew. In all the years she had lived in that town, she had never heard it spoken. Yet Daniel had written about him with a gravity that made it clear this man had mattered. She rose and went to the small cabinet beside the door. Inside were the old ledgers Daniel had used to record his work. The pages smelled faintly of sawdust and oil, of evenings spent calculating the cost of boards and nails. She flipped through them slowly, her eyes searching for something that might connect the name to her husband's work. Near the back of one ledger, written in Daniel's small, precise handwriting, she found a list of deliveries and names. Among them, the initials E. Collins. The entry was dated the same summer Daniel had spent long weeks away from home. Margaret traced the name with the tip of her finger. The ink had faded slightly, but the letters were clear. Beneath it, Daniel had written the word repairs and a small note about a workshop on the edge of town. She remembered that year well. Remembered how he would come home late, smelling faintly of smoke and varnish. He had said the work was good, that it would help them through the winter. She had believed him without question. Now, with the name staring back at her from the page, belief felt less like trust and more like blindness. The kettle whistled softly on the stove, breaking the stillness. She poured more coffee and stood by the window again. A thin veil of light fell over the fields. The fog was lifting now, revealing the dry ridges of earth, the posts, the fences, the slow curve of the land leading to the woods. Everything looked as it always had, yet the knowledge of what lay beneath the soil changed it. The earth no longer felt like a friend, it felt like a witness. As the morning stretched on, she decided to go into town. The air outside was cool and still. The road from her gate was narrow, lined with stones and small bursts of yellow grass. The sound of gravel under the tires echoed softly as she drove. It had been weeks since she had left the farm. The town appeared as it always did, modest and quiet, with a handful of shops, the small white church, and the courthouse that looked larger than it truly was. Margaret parked near the old archive building. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of paper. A man at the counter looked up from his desk with polite curiosity. His grey hair framed a face that spoke of long patience and routine. She asked if there were public records for local businesses from the late 1980s. He nodded and led her to a row of metal cabinets at the back of the room. The drawers opened with a soft metallic sigh, revealing folders labeled by year. She searched carefully, her eyes scanning each name. When she reached the section for 1987, she found it, a record for Edward Collins, carpenter. The address matched the one written in Daniel's ledger. Her chest tightened as she read the last entry beside the name, Deceased, Accidental Fire, July 1987. She closed the drawer slowly. The sound echoed through the quiet room. A note of finality settled over her. It was not proof of guilt, but it was enough to disturb the peace she had guarded for so long. Outside, the day had turned bright. The sunlight struck the pale bricks of the buildings and warmed the air. Margaret walked slowly toward the car, her hands trembling slightly. She sat behind the wheel and stared at the steering column, her thoughts shifting between disbelief and sorrow. The world outside the window looked calm, but inside her something had begun to move, like water beneath ice. The drive home passed in silence. She did not turn on the radio. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires against the road filled the empty spaces. When she reached the gate, the house stood waiting as it always did, simple and unassuming, a picture of quiet, rural life. Yet now, it seemed smaller, as if it too carried the burden of what had been unearthed. She carried the box into her bedroom and placed it on the chest at the foot of the bed. The letter she left folded inside, the watch beside it. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her lap, and tried to imagine the conversation Daniel might have wanted to have if he had lived long enough to speak those words aloud. He had always been cautious with speech, but when he spoke of serious things, his tone had carried the weight of stone. Margaret remembered the day of the accident that had taken him. The phone call had come in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end had been calm, almost too calm, as it explained that the truck had slid off the road near the bridge outside of town. There had been no pain, they said, and no one else involved. The memory came back now with strange clarity, as if the sound of that voice had been waiting all these years to remind her that stories are never as simple as they first appear. The afternoon light faded into the house, soft and golden. Dust floated in slow motion through the beams that crossed the wooden floor. She rose and opened the back door. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then silence returned. She stepped outside and looked toward the field, the same field where she had found the box. The disturbed patch of earth was now dry, the soil darker than the rest, like a scar that the land would keep for her. Margaret stood there until the first stars began to appear. Her thoughts moved in quiet circles. She did not yet know what to do with what she had found. She only knew that truth, once uncovered, refuses to be buried again. She turned toward the house, the light from the window guiding her steps. That night, she placed the letter beside the lamp on her nightstand and left the box open on the table by the door. The watch lay inside it, glinting faintly under the lamplight. She could not bring herself to close it again. As she lay down, she thought of Daniel's final words written in the letter and felt a strange mixture of fear and grace settle over her. Whatever had been hidden beneath the soil had now entered the house. It lived in the air she breathed and in the silence between heartbeats. It waited, not to destroy, but to be understood. The night outside deepened, and the wind turned cold across the fields. The house, once just a home, had become the keeper of a story that was no longer sleeping. The morning broke quiet and pale over the farmlands, with the kind of light that softens everything it touches. The house stood still against the slow movement of dawn, its roof glistening faintly from the dew that had gathered overnight. Margaret woke before the sun had fully risen. Her eyes opened not from rest, but from the persistence of thoughts that had followed her through every hour of the night. The letter, the box, and the watch lingered in her mind like guests that would not leave. She rose and moved through the small rooms of the house in silence. The air was cool, the floors faintly cold under her feet. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then leaned against the counter and listened to the quiet pulse of the flame. Her reflection appeared faintly in the window, washed in the blue light of early morning. Behind her on the table, the box waited as it had the day before. The letter rested inside, folded neatly, its edges still marked by the touch of soil. She thought about how Daniel had written those words in the final days of his life, how he must have buried them, knowing that one day she would find them. The whistle of the kettle rose softly. She poured the hot water into her cup and sat at the table. The first sip of coffee felt distant, as though her body remembered the ritual, but her mind could not follow it. She stared at the box, the way its shape broke the stillness of the room, and wondered if there was more to be found in what Daniel had left unsaid. The morning light grew stronger. Outside, a tractor rumbled faintly on a far field, and birds began their slow songs along the fence line. The world around her continued as it always had, but Margaret felt as though she had stepped out of the rhythm that governed everything else. Her days had once been built on routines, and those routines had once given her peace. Now, each moment felt like waiting. She stood and walked to the bookshelf in the corner of the room. On the middle shelf sat an old album of photographs that had gathered dust over the years. She brought it to the table and opened it carefully, the yellowed plastic pages crackling as she turned them. The first pages showed the early years of their marriage, images of small celebrations and modest smiles. There were photographs of Daniel working in his shop, of the church gatherings, of fields after harvest. Near the back, she found a photograph that made her hand pause. It showed Daniel standing beside another man in front of a half-built cabinet. The picture was faded, but the outline of the other man's face was clear enough to study. He had a strong jaw, a tidy moustache, and a warmth in his expression that suggested trust. On the bottom edge of the photograph, written in Daniel's handwriting, were the words, "Workshop, Summer 1987. She looked closer and noticed that the man beside Daniel wore a pocket watch on a small chain, glinting in the sunlight that had once touched that moment. Margaret closed the album slowly. The house seemed to grow quieter. The name on the watch had now found a face. The photograph made the story real. She sat for a long time, her fingers resting on the cover of the album, her thoughts turning to all the details that had never made sense before. The weeks Daniel had been away, the smell of smoke in his clothes, the distance that had grown between them in those final months without either of them knowing how to speak about it. The air inside the room grew warmer as the morning light filled it. Margaret stood and moved to the porch, carrying the photograph with her. The field stretched before her, still marked by the small patch of darker soil where she had dug. The memory of the shovel striking wood returned to her with vivid clarity. She sat in the old chair by the door and let the sunlight touch her face. It was not peace, she felt, but a quiet acceptance that truth would not remain buried. Later that morning, she took the photograph to the church. Pastor Lewis was there, sweeping the steps as he often did before the Sunday service. He greeted her with a kind smile that faded slightly when he saw the look on her face. She handed him the photograph and waited as he studied it. He nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the details of the two men in the picture. He said nothing at first, only looked at her with an understanding that did not need explanation. In the office at the back of the church, he opened a small drawer and pulled out an old ledger filled with the names of parishioners. The paper had yellowed, and the ink had bled slightly over the years. He turned to the page for the summer of 1987. His finger moved down the list until it stopped near the bottom. "Edward Collins," he said softly. "Yes, I remember him now. He came to the service a few times that summer, a quiet man, always sitting near the back. He built furniture for half the town." Margaret listened without speaking. The pastor closed the book gently and looked at her again. "He died in that fire out by the workshop, didn't he?" he said. She nodded. He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Your husband was at his funeral. I remember Daniel standing at the edge of the crowd. He left before it ended. I never thought much of it then, but he looked heavier that day, as if the air itself weighed more around him." The pastor's voice softened as he continued. "Sometimes, Margaret, we carry things we believe we must protect others from. Men like Daniel are built that way. They think pain can be buried if they dig deep enough, but the ground never keeps secrets forever." Margaret looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. The pastor's words settled over her like dust over old wood. They did not accuse. They only revealed the quiet truth that had lived beside her for years. She thanked him and stepped outside into the sunlight. The day had grown bright, the air warmer now. The small bell above the church door swayed gently in the wind, its soft ringing fading as she walked down the steps. Back home, the house felt different. The photograph lay on the kitchen table beside the box, the two of them silent companions in the growing light. She sat once more and opened the letter again, her eyes tracing every line as though new meaning might appear between them. The words did not change, but their weight did. She could almost hear Daniel's voice in them now, not as confession, but as surrender. As the afternoon drifted into evening, she moved through the house with a steady calm. She lit a small lamp in the living room and placed the photograph in a frame beside Daniel's picture on the mantel. The two men, side by side, watched the room together. The gold watch remained in its box, no longer hidden, no longer buried, but still not fully understood. Outside, the sky burned orange and pink over the horizon. The field behind the house glowed faintly, every blade of grass tipped with light. The sound of crickets began to rise, blending with the soft hum of the wind. Margaret stood on the porch as the first stars appeared, feeling the cool air move against her skin. For years, she had thought that silence was emptiness. Now she knew it was full of the things people cannot say, full of the truths that wait patiently for the right moment to be seen. When night came, she sat by the window and watched the dark settle over the land. The letter remained open on the table, the ink glinting faintly in the lamplight. The air smelled of pine and rain carried on the wind from distant hills. She closed her eyes and let her breathing match the slow rhythm of the night. Somewhere beyond the edge of her thoughts, she could almost sense Daniel's presence, not as guilt or apology, but as a quiet wish for peace. She knew the days ahead would bring questions she had yet to answer, but she also knew that the truth, however painful, had already begun to heal something inside the silence of her home. In the darkness, the clock ticked gently. Each sound marked the steady passing of a life moving forward, one breath at a time, through the light and the shadows of what had been buried and finally found. The following day began with a light wind drifting through the valley. The sun had not yet reached the porch when Margaret stepped outside holding a cup of coffee that steamed faintly in the cool air. The world around her looked unchanged, yet she felt its weight differently now. The discovery of the photograph, the name in the records, and the words of the pastor had joined together like pieces of a puzzle that she was still learning how to see. The field stretched before her in quiet rhythm, the same earth that had hidden her husband's secret for decades. She walked to the edge of the yard where the soil had been disturbed and stood for a long time, her gaze fixed on that small patch of darker ground. It seemed still, but the longer she looked, the more it reminded her that even stillness holds motion beneath it. The breeze lifted strands of her hair as she walked back toward the house. Inside, the light filtered through the curtains in narrow lines, falling across the wooden floor. The photograph she had framed the night before remained on the mantel beside Daniel's portrait. For a moment, she thought about moving it somewhere less visible, yet something in her refused. Hiding it again would be like burying the truth a second time. The photograph belonged there, among the things that had shaped her life, between the love she had known and the truth she was learning to face. She returned to the table and opened one of Daniel's old notebooks. The pages were filled with lists of supplies, drawings of furniture, and short prayers written in the margins. The handwriting told its own story, steady and deliberate in the earlier pages, softer and uneven in the later ones. It was as though the weight of unspoken things had found its way into his hand. In one of the final entries, he had written a line that caught her breath. "Some debts are paid in silence." She read it again, tracing the words with her finger. It was not a phrase meant for business. It belonged to the same man who had buried a letter and asked for forgiveness that could not be spoken aloud. The morning passed slowly. Margaret walked through the house, touching objects as though they could answer questions. The quilt on the couch, the books Daniel had read, the tools that still hung neatly in the shed. Each one felt alive with traces of him. When she reached the porch again, she noticed a vehicle approaching along the dirt road. The truck was the same one that had stopped by her gate days earlier. The sight of it sent a faint tremor through her chest, not from fear, but from the knowledge that the past was no longer content to remain silent. The young man parked near the fence and stepped out, his movements careful, respectful of the space between them. Margaret waited as he approached. His face carried the same quiet determination as before, and his eyes reflected a gentleness that reminded her of his grandfather's photograph. He removed his cap and greeted her softly. She motioned for him to come inside, and they entered the kitchen where the box still sat on the table, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The air inside was still and heavy, filled with the smell of coffee and wood polish. The young man looked at the framed photograph on the mantel and then at the watch resting beside the box. He stood for a long moment without speaking, and Margaret could see in his face the same searching that had filled her own days. He took a deep breath and sat down. His hands rested on the table, open, steady. Margaret sat across from him, her fingers folded together in her lap. For a time, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything both of them already understood, but could not yet name. Finally, the young man reached into his jacket and placed something on the table, a small folded paper that looked old but well kept. He explained that he had found it among his mother's things. It was a letter his grandfather had written shortly before his death, one that mentioned a partner named Daniel. The words spoke of a mistake during a job, a fire that started from a faulty connection, and a man who had tried to help but left before the flames grew beyond control. Margaret's eyes filled with quiet disbelief. The letter was written in the same careful tone as Daniel's, the same rhythm of regret wrapped in humility. She realized then that both men had been bound not by betrayal but by tragedy. Edward had trusted Daniel, and Daniel had tried to make things right in the only way he knew how, by hiding the truth to protect both families from the pain of blame. The knowledge came to her not as a relief, but as a slow, heavy understanding. She read the letter twice before setting it down. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. The young man sat still, watching her with a calm that seemed beyond his years. Margaret folded the letter gently and placed it beside Daniel's. The 2 pages lay there like echoes of one another, the handwriting different yet the message the same. 2 men asking for forgiveness in different ways. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the weight of that forgiveness move through her like wind through the trees. When she opened her eyes again, the young man was standing near the window, looking out at the field. He spoke softly, saying that his mother had always believed there was more to her father's death, but she had never found the answers. Margaret rose and stood beside him. The field stretched wide and endless, the soil dark and rich from recent rain. It had held so many seasons, so many secrets, and now it held their understanding as well. The young man turned toward her and nodded. There was no anger in his face, only peace. Margaret walked with him to the porch. The wind carried the faint scent of clover and rain. She told him that the box would remain in her home, not as a relic of guilt, but as a memory of 2 men who had worked hard and made mistakes they had not known how to face. He agreed and said that truth, even when it comes late, is still a kind of grace. She watched him drive away down the long dirt road until the truck became a small blur in the distance, swallowed by the horizon. When she returned to the house, the afternoon sun was leaning low across the fields. The light filled the room with a golden hue that softened every corner. She placed both letters inside the wooden box and set the watch beside them. For the first time since uncovering it, she closed the lid. Her hands lingered on the wood for a long moment. It felt warm, as though the earth had not yet released its touch. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for answers but for peace. Peace for Daniel, for Edward, and for herself. As evening fell, she lit a single lamp and sat by the window. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the field, and the faint sound of crickets rose with the coming night. She thought of the years she had spent carrying the image of Daniel as a man without flaw, and she realized that love does not vanish when the truth arrives. It simply changes its shape. Love becomes understanding, and understanding becomes mercy. The stars began to appear one by one above the valley. Margaret rested her hand on the window pane, the cool glass pressing lightly against her skin. The air outside was still, the kind of stillness that exists not from emptiness, but from completion. For the first time in years, she felt that the silence surrounding her home was not loneliness, but rest, the quiet that follows when a long story finally finds its ending. She stood and walked to the mantel, where the 2 photographs waited side by side. Daniel's eyes caught the lamplight, and Edward's image, though faded, seemed to share the same warmth. Margaret smiled faintly, not out of joy, but out of recognition. The men in those photographs had lived, erred, and sought forgiveness. That was enough. Before she went to bed, she stepped out once more onto the porch. The night air carried the scent of wet earth, and a thin ribbon of fog had begun to form over the low field. The moonlight touched the edges of the grass, turning it silver. She stood there for a long time, her breath steady, her heart calm. The past had not vanished, but it no longer ruled the house. It had become part of it, like the wood of the floor, the grain of the table, the quiet hum of the clock. Inside, the box rested on the mantel, no longer a symbol of secrets, but of truth finally brought into the light. And as the night deepened around her, Margaret felt something she had not felt in many years, the peace of a life that could move forward again, not by forgetting, but by remembering with grace. The dawn came soft and unhurried, painting the valley in quiet shades of gold and grey. The mist rose from the ground in long ribbons that drifted over the fences and across the wide fields behind Margaret's home. From her window, she watched the world emerge from the shadows, the line of trees in the distance taking shape, like memories returning after a long absence. The air carried the faint scent of wet earth and pine. It was the kind of morning that seemed to belong to the past, when days began with work and ended with the comfort of firelight. Yet this morning held something new, something that made the silence around her feel gentler than before. She moved through the house with deliberate calm, her steps measured on the old floorboards. The wooden box rested on the mantel, closed now, but no longer heavy with mystery. The weight that had pressed against her chest for days had lifted, leaving in its place a stillness that was not empty, but full of acceptance, of truth, of the quiet knowledge that pain does not erase love. It only deepens it. She ran her fingers along the edge of the box as she passed, the grain smooth beneath her hand, and whispered a silent thought of gratitude for what had been revealed. The kettle began to hum softly on the stove. As she poured the hot water into her cup, the steam curled upward and fogged the window. Beyond the glass, the fields shimmered with dew, and in that shimmer she could see echoes of every season she had lived there. The green abundance of spring, the long labor of summer, the soft dying of autumn, the still endurance of winter. The land had always carried her forward, even when she had felt too tired to move. It had carried Daniel too, in his work, in his silence, in the secret he had carried until the end. Margaret sat by the table and opened one of Daniel's old ledgers. She had not looked through them since the day she found the photograph. The pages were covered in numbers, lists of wood types, and sketches of projects he had completed over the years. She turned the pages slowly, and on one of them she found a note written in the corner, a verse from the Book of Psalms. The ink had faded, but the words remained legible. Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. She traced the letters with her fingertip. The words felt alive, as though they had been waiting for her to read them now, in this moment when they could finally be understood. As the sun climbed higher, the air warmed, filling the room with golden light. She opened the back door and stepped outside. The wind brushed softly against her face, carrying with it the sound of distant birds. The ground beneath her feet was firm, the earth dry after several days without rain. She walked to the far side of the yard, where the soil had once been disturbed. The dark patch was barely visible now, smoothed over by wind and time. Yet even as nature reclaimed it, she could still feel the memory of that moment when her shovel struck the wooden box. It was strange how one small sound could divide a life into before and after. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the air and feeling the quiet pulse of the world around her. The land stretched wide and endless, holding both memory and forgiveness in its silence. She thought of the letters, Daniel's and Edward's, lying side by side inside the box. Two men whose mistakes had met in the same fire, whose regrets had been buried under the same soil, and whose peace had come through the same act of uncovering. The thought filled her with an ache that was not sorrow, but understanding. Sometimes the truth takes the long way home. By mid-morning, Margaret drove into town. She parked near the church and walked to the small garden behind it. Pastor Lewis was kneeling near the fence, trimming a patch of roses. He stood when he saw her, his face calm and warm. She carried the box in her hands, wrapped in a folded cloth. When she reached him, she placed it gently on the bench beside the roses. The pastor looked at her, waiting. She told him everything, how the letters had been found, how the truth had revealed itself through the grandson's visit, how peace had begun to take root where pain once lived. She spoke without haste, her voice low but steady. Pastor Lewis listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded, his eyes glistening with quiet respect. He said that truth, when finally spoken, becomes a kind of prayer. It may not erase what happened, but it sanctifies it, making it part of something larger than regret. He suggested that the letters remain in the church archive, not as a record of wrongdoing, but as a testament to forgiveness. Margaret agreed. She handed him the box, and he promised that it would be kept with care, not displayed, not forgotten, but held in the still dignity of remembrance. She felt a lightness in her chest as she handed it over, as though the act of release had completed something she had not realized was unfinished. Afterward, she sat for a while on the church steps. The sky above was clear and wide, and the bell tower cast a long shadow across the gravel path. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of children playing somewhere nearby. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the fullness of the present moment, not the weight of the past or the fear of the future, but the simple grace of being alive in the quiet between them. When she returned home that afternoon, the house felt different. The absence of the box left a space that did not feel empty. It felt honest, as though the house itself could breathe again. She walked through each room, touching the furniture Daniel had built, the walls he had painted, the small details that bore the marks of his hands. The memories no longer hurt. They had softened into something she could carry without sorrow. She lit a candle on the mantel beside the photographs. The flame flickered gently, its light touching both Daniel's face and the faint image of Edward beside him. The two men now shared the same frame of forgiveness, joined not by secrecy, but by truth. The candlelight shimmered over their images, and for a brief moment it looked as if both men were alive again, not as they were, but as they were remembered. As the evening descended, Margaret opened the window to let the cool air in. The sound of crickets filled the night, steady and rhythmic. She sat by the window and looked out over the fields. The horizon stretched endlessly, a soft blur between earth and sky. She thought of Daniel's prayer written in the ledger, of the verse about mercy and truth. The words echoed in her mind like a hymn. They felt like the sum of her life, a life of love, of loss, of forgiveness, found in the quiet corners where no one looks. The stars began to appear, one after another, scattering across the darkening sky. The lamp on the table cast a circle of warm light around her. In that light, she felt the boundaries between past and present fade. Everything that had been hidden had come to the surface. Everything that had been buried had found its place in the open air. When she finally rose to prepare for bed, she looked once more at the photographs. The candle had burned low, and its flame swayed gently in the draught. She smiled faintly, her heart calm. The story that had once been buried beneath her feet now lived in the light of her home. It no longer haunted her. It simply existed, complete, understood, at peace. The night deepened over the valley, the fields shimmering under the pale glow of the moon. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the quiet. It was not silence she heard. It was life continuing, steady and soft, carrying her forward into whatever days remained. The days that followed passed with a calm that Margaret had not known in years. Each morning she woke to the sound of birds along the fence line and the gentle sigh of wind that moved through the pines behind the house. The world seemed lighter now, as though the land itself had drawn a long breath after holding its silence for too long. Her routines returned slowly, not out of habit, but out of a new understanding that peace was built on simple things: the washing of dishes, the tending of a garden, the soft hum of a song remembered from youth. Every act became a way of honoring what had been revealed and what had finally rested. The wooden box no longer occupied the mantel. Its absence left a quiet space that she did not rush to fill. Instead, a small bouquet of wildflowers stood there now, their colors pale and delicate, gathered from the edge of the field where the soil had been disturbed months earlier. She had placed them there not as decoration, but as a gesture of gratitude to the land that had kept her husband's secret until the time was right to uncover it. Each afternoon, when the sun reached the far edge of the porch, she would sit with a cup of tea and look toward the horizon. The fields rolled gently into the distance, their lines soft and forgiving. The wind carried the faint scent of hay and clover. She often thought about Daniel and Edward then, about how both men had lived honest lives, but had been marked by one moment of weakness that neither could undo. The world is often cruel to those who make mistakes, she thought, but time has its own mercy. What cannot be mended in life sometimes finds its healing long after. Pastor Lewis visited a week later. He came walking up the path with his hat in his hand and a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He told her that the box had been placed in the church archives, sealed and recorded, accompanied by a note explaining its purpose. It would rest there as a document of reconciliation rather than guilt. The pastor said that such stories remind people that faith is not about perfection, but about endurance, about finding one's way back to grace. Margaret listened, her hands folded gently on her lap, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that was not pride but peace. After the pastor left, she wandered through the small orchard behind the house. The apple trees were in bloom, their branches heavy with blossoms that caught the sunlight in soft shades of white and pink. She ran her hand along the bark of one tree and remembered when Daniel had planted it. He had said that trees taught patience better than any sermon could, because they waited in silence for the right season to bear fruit. It had been many years since then, but the lesson had not aged. She realized that she, too, had been waiting, not for fruit, but for clarity, and now it had come in its own quiet season. As she returned to the porch, she noticed a small package resting near the door. The handwriting on it was unfamiliar. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a framed photograph of the church garden. A letter accompanied it, written by Caroline, the daughter of Edward Collins. The letter spoke of gratitude for truth, for peace, and for the kindness shown in sharing what had been hidden. Caroline wrote that she had visited the church and seen the box in its resting place, and that she had prayed for both men. They are remembered together now, the letter said, not for their mistakes, but for their humanity. Margaret read the letter twice before setting it on the table beside the photograph. The picture showed the garden bathed in sunlight, the roses blooming behind the wooden bench where she had once sat with the pastor. The colors were gentle and alive, the kind of beauty that carries both sorrow and hope in the same breath. She placed the photograph beside the wildflowers on the mantel. The house felt whole again, as if every corner of it had found its purpose. That evening, she cooked a simple meal and ate by the window. The sound of crickets filled the air, blending with the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. The candlelight flickered against the glass, and for the first time in years, she felt no weight pressing on her heart. The memories that had once haunted her had softened into something she could carry with tenderness. She no longer asked why things had happened the way they did. The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was the peace that followed. The following morning, she walked to the church once more. The path was lined with tall grass that brushed against her skirt as she passed. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting soft colors on the wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of wax and old wood. She knelt in the front pew, her hands clasped together, and prayed, not for forgiveness, but for gratitude. Gratitude for the years she had shared with Daniel, for the truth that had set her free, and for the simple gift of growing old with dignity. When she rose, she walked toward the small alcove where the church kept its records. The door was closed, but she could feel the presence of the box behind it. She rested her hand against the wood and whispered a quiet blessing. The moment felt sacred in its simplicity. Then she turned and stepped back into the sunlight, the warmth on her skin steady and kind. Life resumed its gentle rhythm. Days became weeks, and the seasons turned once more. The leaves changed color, the air grew crisp, and the fields prepared for their long rest. Margaret continued her work, tending the land, mending what needed care, writing short notes in the margins of her own journal. Sometimes she would write verses she remembered from the Bible, sometimes small reflections about the weather or the sound of the wind through the orchard. Her words were not meant for anyone else. They were her way of keeping company with time. In early autumn, she received another letter, this time from John Collins, the grandson who had first come to her door. He wrote that his mother had found peace at last, that she had forgiven the years of silence and now spoke of Daniel with respect. John said he hoped to visit again in the spring to help mend the old fence that ran along the back of her property. He said the land reminded him of his grandfather, and he wished to lend his hands to it. Margaret smiled as she read the words. It felt right that the descendants of both men would share the same soil in peace. When she finished reading, she placed the letter inside her journal and looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The fields glowed in the fading light, and a soft breeze moved through the open window, carrying with it the scent of earth and the promise of rain. Margaret stood quietly for a moment, her hand resting on the frame of the window, her heart steady. She thought of Daniel and Edward, of their mistakes and their redemption, of the long path that had led her here. She whispered a single line to the evening air, not as prayer, not as farewell, but as truth. Peace is not the absence of sorrow, it is the acceptance of all that was. As night settled, the house glowed faintly from the light of a single lamp. The quiet inside was not the silence of loneliness anymore, but of grace. Margaret sat in her chair by the window, wrapped in her shawl, watching the stars bloom above the dark line of trees. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang softly, its sound carried by the wind across the open fields. The house that had once held secrets now held peace. The woman who had once feared the past now lived within its light, and the land, faithful as ever, rested under the stars, keeping its silent watch over all that had been forgiven. Winter arrived with a quiet grace that wrapped the land in a pale stillness. The fields beyond Margaret's home turned the color of straw, and frost lined the fence rails in delicate patterns that glittered in the first light of morning. Each breath she took seemed to carry a small cloud, and every sound, every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves felt sharper in the cold. The days were shorter now, and the house filled with the faint scent of pine wood from the fire that burned slow and steady in the hearth. Margaret's life had settled into a rhythm once again, but it was not the rhythm of before. It was calmer, softer, like a song that had learned to breathe between notes. The truth had changed her, not by breaking her, but by shaping her into someone who understood that even the hardest truths can rest gently when faced with grace. She had lived long enough to know that peace does not erase the past. It simply learns to live beside it. Each morning, she sat at the small table near the window, a blanket around her shoulders, a cup of coffee cooling beside her notebook. She had begun to write letters again, not to anyone who would receive them, but to Daniel. They were short, simple letters about the days that passed. She wrote about the frost on the ground, the birds that gathered near the orchard, the slow rhythm of her heart when she thought of him without sorrow. Writing had become her prayer, her way of speaking across the thin veil between memory and time. Sometimes, when she paused her pen, she would imagine Daniel sitting across from her, not as the man who had buried secrets, but as the man she had married, the man who laughed in the sunlight, who built their porch with his bare hands, who sang softly under his breath while sanding a piece of wood smooth. She could almost hear his voice, calm and low, saying that he had always loved her, even when he did not know how to tell the truth. Those moments came without pain now. They came as warmth, as light that did not fade. By mid-morning, she would walk outside, wrapped in her shawl, and feed the birds near the fence. The world seemed asleep, but she could feel life hidden under the frost, the soil waiting, the roots patient. It reminded her of herself. For years, she had lived beneath the surface, waiting for something she could not name. Now she understood that waiting had been her own form of faith. The wind bit at her cheeks, and she smiled faintly at the cold. There was something honest about it, something that stripped away everything unnecessary. Inside, the mantel still held the two photographs side by side. The candle had burned low, but she had replaced it with a small oil lamp that gave off a soft golden glow each night. The framed image of Daniel seemed to have changed over time, not in its appearance, but in how she saw it. Once it had been a reminder of what she had lost. Now it was a reminder of what she had learned. His eyes, steady and kind, seemed to hold no defense anymore, only peace. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the church. Pastor Lewis wrote to tell her that a few families had come to visit the archive where the box was kept. He said they had read the story of the two craftsmen, their friendship, their mistake, their reconciliation through faith, and had been moved to tears. The letter said that one man, whose father had once worked for Edward Collins, had left a note of gratitude for the reminder that forgiveness still matters, in a world that forgets too quickly. The pastor's closing words said that truth, when shared humbly, can become a sermon without words. Margaret read the letter several times, her eyes blurring with quiet tears. She folded it carefully and placed it in her Bible, between the pages of Psalms. It felt right to keep it there, near the verses that had guided her through the hardest season of her life. For the first time, she felt certain that the pain she had carried had not been in vain. Even sorrow, when faced with faith, could grow into something that blessed others. As December deepened, snow began to fall across the valley. It came softly at first, a thin dusting that turned the ground white and pure. The fields, once dark and open, became a vast expanse of light. Margaret watched from the window as flakes drifted against the glass. The snow muted every sound, turning the world into a place where even memory seemed to move more slowly. She felt no loneliness in that quiet. Instead, she felt a closeness to everything that had come before, a connection that needed no words. On Christmas Eve, she attended the candlelight service at the church for the first time in years. The pews were filled with families, their voices rising together in old hymns that carried warmth into the cold air. When the candles were lit, the church seemed to glow from within. Margaret sat near the back, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the small flame in front of her. It flickered gently, its light reflected in the faces of those around her. Pastor Lewis spoke of grace that evening. He said that grace is not earned or deserved, but revealed in the act of truth itself. It appears when hearts open to what is painful, when love chooses understanding over judgment. Margaret listened, her heart steady, her eyes damp. When the service ended, she lingered for a moment as others filed out into the snowy night. She walked to the front of the church and knelt by the nativity scene. The candles around it burned low, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and wax. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for forgiveness, not even for gratitude, but for faith to remain steady in whatever years were left to her. The next morning, Christmas dawned clear and bright. The snow reflected the sunlight in blinding white stretches across the hills. Margaret wrapped herself in her thick coat and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, but the light was beautiful. She walked to the edge of the field and stood there, her boots sinking slightly into the snow. The horizon seemed endless, a vast stretch of sky and earth meeting in perfect stillness. She thought of Daniel again, not as absence, but as presence. His life, his silence, his mistakes, and his love were all part of her own story now. There was no separation between what was gone and what remained. Everything had woven itself into the same fabric. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from joy, but from understanding. When she returned to the house, she lit the lamp on the mantel. The flame wavered, then steadied. The photographs glowed softly in its light, and the warmth filled the room with a sense of quiet belonging. Margaret sat down in her chair, the one that faced the window, and watched the snow drift beyond the glass. Outside, the sun began to lower, turning the world into shades of pink and gold. The snow sparkled like glass. The house creaked softly as it settled against the cold. Inside, Margaret felt no emptiness, no fear of the years ahead. She felt instead a deep and lasting peace, the kind that grows in silence, that survives loss, that understands love not as perfection, but as presence. The world outside might change, the seasons might fade, but within the walls of that small wooden house, truth had found its home. The secret once buried beneath the soil had become a story of mercy. The pain that had lived in her heart had turned into strength, and the woman who once feared the quiet now welcomed it as the purest sound of all. The winter faded slowly that year. The snow melted in quiet streams that traced their way down the fields, and the ground drank it all with a hunger that only the earth understands. By late February, the mornings had softened, and the frost that once coated the windows gave way to thin layers of mist that rose from the soil at dawn. The days grew longer, the sun climbing a little higher each afternoon. Margaret moved through the changing season with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through so much. The peace that had found her in the quiet days of winter now followed her into the light of spring. She began her mornings early again, opening the windows to let the new air into the house. The scent of damp earth and pine drifted through the rooms, filling them with life. The wooden floors creaked beneath her steps as she went about her chores, sweeping, dusting, folding the linens she had washed the day before. Everything she touched seemed to hold its own memory. The kitchen table where she had unfolded the letter, the chair where she had once wept in silence, the porch where she had watched the truck disappear down the road. The past was still present in every corner of her home, but it no longer carried pain. It had settled into something gentle, something she could live with. One morning, while tending to the small garden behind the house, Margaret found the first signs of new growth. The ground had thawed enough for the earliest shoots of wildflowers to push through. Their fragile stems bent under the morning dew, trembling slightly in the wind. She knelt to clear away the dead leaves that had gathered around them and smiled faintly. Nature, she thought, was God's way of reminding people that renewal never asks for permission. It simply happens. She worked through the morning until the sun climbed high. The sound of the nearby river carried faintly on the breeze. It had been years since she'd walked down to the riverbank, but something in her stirred that day. She followed the narrow path behind the orchard, her boots leaving shallow prints in the damp soil. The path wound gently between trees before opening into a clearing where the river moved wide and slow. The water shimmered under the sunlight, and the air smelled of moss and distant rain. Margaret sat on an old fallen log near the edge of the water. The current moved with a patience that reminded her of time itself, never hurried, always forward. She picked up a small stone and held it between her fingers, feeling its smooth surface. She thought about Daniel again, about how much of him was still part of her life, even after all these years. His voice still lingered in the quiet moments. His hands still lived in the furniture he had built. Even his silence, once so heavy, had become a kind of comfort. She had learned that love does not vanish when life ends. It changes form and settles into the smallest places, a habit, a memory, a song half remembered. The wind stirred the surface of the water, breaking the reflection of the sky into ripples. She dropped the stone into the river and watched the circles widen and fade. That small act felt like a prayer, not one spoken aloud, but one made of movement and surrender. Every ripple carried the story she had lived, every circle a reminder that what begins in secrecy can still end in light. When she returned home that afternoon, the light had softened into the warm tones of early evening. The fields glowed gold under the sun's descent. She paused by the fence and looked out over the land. It stretched endlessly, quiet and loyal. Daniel had loved this view, and she understood now why he had never wanted to leave it. It was not the land itself that held him. It was the life they had built upon it, the work, the care, the faith. Everything that mattered had happened here, within the reach of those fields and that small wooden house. The mail arrived that evening. Among the usual envelopes was one with handwriting she recognized immediately. It was from John Collins. Inside, he had written to tell her that he and his mother had visited the church again, bringing new flowers for the garden. He said the pastor had added a small plaque beneath the roses, a simple piece of brass engraved with the words, "In truth, there is peace." John wrote that his mother had smiled for the first time in years as she read those words. He said that they had prayed together, thanking God for the courage that truth had required and the mercy that had followed. Margaret held the letter close to her chest for a moment before folding it neatly and placing it beside her journal. She sat at the table, letting the warmth of the setting sun fall across her hands. The light turned the pages of her notebook golden, and the air in the room felt alive with quiet grace. She opened the journal and wrote a single line beneath the date. Truth grows like spring grass. Once revealed, it never hides again. As the days passed, spring took hold of the valley. The apple trees in the orchard filled with blossoms, their petals falling in soft drifts that covered the ground like pale snow. The air buzzed faintly with bees, and the smell of new grass mixed with the faint smoke from her chimney. Margaret spent her afternoons sitting on the porch, shelling peas or mending clothes, her gaze often drifting toward the far side of the property where the soil had been turned. It was hard to believe that something buried there had once held so much pain. Now, that same ground seemed to pulse with life. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, a rare thing, but welcome. They brought fresh bread or news from town, and though Margaret had never been one for long conversation, she found herself smiling more easily than before. She no longer carried the heaviness in her voice that had marked the years of solitude. There was lightness in her now, a quiet wisdom that others noticed but could not quite name. The story she carried was her own, yet it had shaped her into something larger than her sorrow. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, the wind shifted and carried the faint sound of church bells from the town below. She looked up toward the horizon where the steeple stood, barely visible through the trees. The bells rang softly, their echoes rolling across the fields like waves. The sound reached her slowly, mingling with the rustle of leaves, and she felt a peace that was almost holy. It was the sound of time continuing, of grace made audible. That night as the sun set, she lit the oil lamp on the mantel once again. The photographs glowed in its light, and for the first time she noticed how the two men seemed to face each other, as if caught in an endless conversation that no longer required words. She stood before them, her eyes soft, and whispered a single sentence into the room. "You are both forgiven." The lamp's flame flickered slightly in the draught from the window, then steadied. The words did not echo, but their meaning filled the space. Forgiveness had not come through confession or apology, but through truth, the simple, unwavering truth that had risen from the earth like light through dark soil. Margaret turned off the lamp and stood for a while in the half-dark, watching the faint glow fade. She felt no sadness, only gratitude. The story that had begun with a buried box had become something far greater than she could have imagined. A story of two men, two families, and a woman who had found peace in the middle of their silence. Outside, the wind moved gently through the orchard, carrying with it the scent of blossoms and rain. The land that had once held secrets now held only life, and in that life, Margaret finally found her rest. By late April, the air in the valley had warmed, carrying the scent of clover and wild mint. The wind that once bit with winter's sharpness now moved softly, brushing through the fields in waves that shimmered under the morning sun. Margaret's home, weathered but steadfast, stood like part of the landscape itself, its wood silvered by years of rain, its porch wrapped in vines that had begun to bloom again. The world seemed to have remembered life, and in that renewal, Margaret found her own quiet rebirth. The days unfolded gently, each one full of small tasks that grounded her, watering the flowers, polishing the wooden banister, feeding the stray cat that had begun to visit her porch each morning. She named it Henry, after the pastor who had helped her through the storm of truth, and though the animal never came close enough to touch, its company was a comfort. It reminded her that even wild things return to gentle places when the air feels safe again. The journal on her table had grown thicker with pages. She wrote in it daily, though her words had changed. At first, she had written to Daniel, her sentences filled with longing and unfinished questions. Now she wrote about the land, the sky, and the simple wonder of waking to another day. Her handwriting had steadied, her words had slowed. There was no longer any need to explain or search. She wrote only to remember. Sometimes, in the early hours, she walked down the dirt road that led toward town. The road curved through fields where the wheat had just begun to rise in tender green rows. The smell of tilled earth filled the air, and she could hear the distant sound of tractors echoing across the open land. Life continued, as it always did, as it always would. Yet as she passed the small rise, where the view opened wide, she would stop and look back toward her house, that small shape of wood and stone that had become the center of so many endings and beginnings. It stood quietly, unassuming, but strong. One morning, a familiar truck appeared in the distance, raising a faint cloud of dust behind it. Margaret shaded her eyes with her hand as it drew closer. When it stopped at her gate, she recognized John Collins stepping out. Taller than before, his movements steady and confident. He waved, his smile soft and respectful. In his hands, he carried a box wrapped in plain brown paper. She opened the gate and greeted him with a nod. Inside the house, he set the box gently on the table and explained that it was from his mother. She had passed the previous winter peacefully after a long illness. In her final months, she had spoken often of Daniel, of the fire, and of the strange grace that had come from the truth between their families. The box contained something she had wanted Margaret to have, a collection of letters, a few old photographs, and a wooden carving of two joined hands. The carving had been Edward's last, unfinished project. He had been shaping it when the fire took his life. Margaret sat in silence, her fingers brushing the edge of the carving. It was simple but full of meaning, the two hands meeting not in farewell, but in forgiveness. The grain of the wood was smooth, the lines gentle, as if Edward had worked with patience rather than precision. She placed it beside the photographs on the mantel, the joined hands beneath the faces of both men. John stayed for tea, and they spoke quietly as the afternoon sunlight filled the room. He told her stories of his childhood, of his mother's strength, of how faith had shaped their family, even in the absence of answers. Margaret listened, her heart both heavy and light. She shared stories of Daniel's humor, of his steady nature, of the kindness that had always lived beneath his silence. They laughed softly at small memories, two people bound by history but not by pain. When he rose to leave, John said something that stayed with her long after he drove away. "My grandfather and your husband, I think they would have liked knowing that peace came from their mistakes." His words lingered in the air, and Margaret understood that he was right. Peace had not come through the absence of pain, but through its transformation. What had once been buried had now become a bridge. That night, after John's truck disappeared into the horizon, Margaret sat by the fire and opened the small bundle of letters he had brought. They were written by Edward to his daughter during her youth, letters full of hope and lessons about honesty, kindness, and the value of hard work. One line, written in a neat but worn hand, caught her attention. "Truth is not light because it is easy. It is light because it shows the way." She folded the letter and placed it beside Daniel's prayer in her own notebook. Together they told the same story, one of human frailty and divine forgiveness. She realized that neither man had ever meant to harm anyone. They had been flawed, yes, but they had also been brave, in the way only ordinary people can be when faced with guilt too heavy to name. Outside, the wind rose softly through the trees. The sound reminded her of waves against the shore, constant and steady. She stood and looked through the window. The moon had risen, bathing the field in silver light. The land seemed alive in its stillness, breathing with her, holding every memory, every truth, every prayer. The next morning she went into town to visit the church. The garden behind it was in full bloom, the roses taller now, the plaque beneath them shining faintly in the sun. She knelt beside it and brushed the dust away from the engraved words. "In truth, there is peace." She smiled and whispered a quiet blessing before standing again. Inside the church, Pastor Lewis greeted her warmly. He told her that people had begun to visit the garden more often, drawn by the story of two men whose mistakes had become a lesson in faith. Some came to leave flowers, others came simply to sit and think. Margaret said little, only nodded, but inside she felt a quiet pride, not for herself, but for the story that had found its way into the hearts of strangers. As she walked back home that afternoon, the road shimmered under the sun. The air was full of the hum of insects and the songs of distant birds. Each sound felt like a reminder that life, no matter how broken it becomes, always finds a way to sing again. When she reached her porch, she paused and looked across the field. The soil that had once concealed so much now held nothing but wildflowers. The colors danced in the breeze, white, yellow and soft blue, a silent hymn growing out of the very place where pain had once lived. She closed her eyes and let the wind touch her face. The moment felt eternal. Inside, the lamp on the mantel cast its gentle glow over the photographs, the letters, and the carving of the two joined hands. Margaret sat down in her chair and rested her hands on her lap. Her eyes softened as she looked around the room that had carried her through so much. Everything she loved was still here, not unchanged but transformed. The story had not ended in sorrow. It had ended in peace. She closed her eyes and whispered to the quiet air, "The truth has done its work." The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, the last light of day faded into the blue of evening. The wind moved gently through the orchard, and the house, warm and still, seemed to breathe with her, alive, steady, and full of grace. Summer came quietly that year, like a long sigh released after seasons of holding breath. The hills around the valley turned golden beneath the sun, and the sound of cicadas rose from the fields in long, steady waves. The air carried the smell of dry earth and wildflowers, and each evening the sky stretched wide with the kind of light that lingered long after sunset. Margaret's days moved in harmony with the slow rhythm of the land. The house, with its creaking floors and soft shadows, had settled into a peace that felt unshakable. The months that followed brought her a new kind of stillness, not the silence of waiting, but the calm of understanding. The truth had come and done its work. Now it lived quietly within her, like a small flame that no wind could touch. Her days were filled with simple things. She tended her garden, polished the wooden furniture Daniel had made, and walked through the orchard each morning before the sun grew strong. The trees were heavy with fruit now, and the scent of ripening apples drifted through the air like memory itself. Sometimes she would find herself speaking softly to the empty air, not out of loneliness, but out of habit. She spoke to Daniel as if he were still beside her, telling him about the weather, about the neighbors, about the stray cat that had now made her porch its home. She even placed a small dish of milk near the step each evening, smiling as the cat approached with slow, careful steps. Life had a way of returning, she thought, even after being gone for a long time. Each Sunday, Margaret walked to the church. The congregation had grown a little, and she noticed new faces, younger ones, full of hope and curiosity. Pastor Lewis often spoke of truth and grace in his sermons, weaving the lessons of her story into the fabric of his words without ever naming her. "When truth rises from the ground," he said one morning, "it does not bring destruction, it brings light. It asks us to see ourselves clearly, to forgive what we find, and to begin again." His voice filled the small chapel, and Margaret felt the words move through her like water through soil. After the service, she always visited the garden behind the church. The roses there had grown thick and strong, their blossoms full and fragrant under the sun. The plaque that read, "In truth, there is peace," shone brighter now, polished by rain and time. She often brought a handful of wildflowers from her own yard to place beside it, a quiet offering of gratitude. People greeted her warmly when they passed, some knowing her story, others not. She had no need to explain. The peace on her face spoke for her. Back home, the light of summer afternoons filled every corner of her house. Dust floated in the beams that slanted through the windows, turning the air into gold. On the mantel, the photographs of Daniel and Edward stood side by side, joined by the small wooden carving of their hands. The oil lamp that once burned beside them now stood unlit during the long, bright days, but its glass still caught the sun and reflected it across the room. Each time she looked at that small altar of memory, she felt no sorrow, only gratitude for the strange path that had led her here. One afternoon, she received a letter from the church addressed in careful handwriting. Inside was a short note from a woman named Ruth Collins, Edward's great-granddaughter. Ruth wrote that she had heard the story from her grandfather John, who had spoken often of Margaret's kindness and strength. She wrote that the story had been passed down like a family prayer, a reminder that truth might sleep, but it never dies. Ruth said she hoped to visit someday, to meet the woman whose courage had turned pain into peace. Margaret smiled as she read the letter. She folded it neatly and placed it in her journal, alongside all the others. The pages had become a chronicle of her life, part memory, part reflection, part prayer. She read through them sometimes in the evenings, her eyes tracing the words she had written in moments of confusion and moments of clarity alike. Each page felt like a step in the long road that had brought her here. As the heat of July deepened, she spent more time outside, sitting beneath the old oak near the edge of her property. The tree's shade stretched wide across the grass, and the ground beneath it smelled faintly of leaves and dust. She brought a book with her sometimes, though she rarely read it. Mostly she listened to the hum of bees, to the wind through the branches, to the faint murmur of the river beyond the trees. The world was alive in its quietness, full of voices that did not need words. One evening, while she sat watching the sunset, she saw something that caught her breath. In the far distance beyond the orchard, two children ran along the path, their laughter carrying faintly through the warm air. She recognized them, the grandchildren of her neighbors from across the hill. They had often waved to her when passing by, their joy unburdened, their energy unending. She watched them now as they chased each other through the tall grass, the light of the setting sun turning their figures to gold. For a moment, she thought of her own youth, of the days when she and Daniel had been young, running through these same fields, full of plans and faith in the future. The sight did not bring sadness, only tenderness. Life continued. New generations would walk these same roads, make new mistakes, uncover new truths. The thought comforted her. She'd once believed that her story had ended with loss, but now she understood it had only changed chapters. The truth had given her peace, but it had also given her something more: perspective. That night, the air cooled, and a storm gathered far off in the distance. She could hear the low roll of thunder as she sat by the window, watching flashes of lightning illuminate the horizon. The sound reminded her of the rain that had fallen the day she found the box, the day her life had shifted. She thought about how storms cleanse the earth, how they bring life, even as they tear through it. She understood now that her own storm had done the same. It had broken her, yes, but it had also washed her clean. When the rain finally reached her house, she opened the window and let the scent of it fill the room. The drops struck the roof in a soft rhythm, and the sound mixed with the ticking of the clock. The fields outside drank deeply, the soil darkening with renewal. Margaret sat quietly, her face turned toward the window, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of lightning. After the storm passed, the world outside grew still again, the air cool and sharp. She closed the window and stood before the mantel once more. The photographs, the carving, and the letters all glowed faintly in the dim light. She rested her hand on the mantel and whispered, "It is finished." Not finished as in ended, but finished as in complete. Every thread of her life, the joy, the pain, the truth, had woven itself into something whole. She could feel it now, the quiet strength of a life lived honestly, of a love that had survived even through silence. The clock struck midnight. The house breathed softly around her, the night full of calm. Margaret turned off the lamp, the glow fading slowly until only the starlight remained. The sound of the rain had ceased, and the wind carried the scent of wet grass through the cracks in the windows. The story that began with a buried box had come to rest not in mystery or sorrow, but in light. The truth had risen, forgiveness had followed, and love, quiet, faithful love, had remained. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered a final prayer, not for herself, but for anyone who would one day find what was buried in their own lives and choose to face it with courage. Outside, the fields shimmered in the moonlight, their silence deep and kind. By the time autumn returned to the valley, the air had changed again. The mornings came cooler, the evenings longer, and the trees around Margaret's house began their slow surrender to gold. The orchard that once bloomed in spring now stood painted in quiet shades of amber and brown, and the fields beyond had taken on that tired beauty that comes before rest. The cycle of the land mirrored her own heart, still, steady, and full of a peace that needed no explanation. The days followed a calm rhythm. Margaret woke early, as she always had, and opened the curtains to greet the dawn. The sunlight came softer now, filtered through the thinning leaves, and each morning it spilled across the wooden floor of her kitchen like a blessing. She brewed her coffee, sat at the small table by the window, and wrote in her journal. The pages were nearly filled. What had begun as letters to her husband had become quiet reflections on grace, time, and forgiveness. Her handwriting had slowed, but the steadiness in her words remained. She wrote not to make sense of the past anymore, but to honor it. Every line felt like a seed planted in the soil of remembrance, meant not to be read by others, but to live quietly in the world she had made whole again. Some afternoons she walked down the path to the river, the same path she had taken that spring when the water shimmered with renewal. Now the current was slower, the river lower, its surface dappled with fallen leaves. She sat on the same log and listened to the water move around the stones. The sound was softer than before, but still constant. She thought about how time wears down even the hardest things, how it smooths what once felt sharp. She had learned to trust that slow mercy. The town below her hill had changed too. New families had moved in, children played on the roads, and the church bell rang with a steadier rhythm. The garden behind the church had grown even more beautiful. The plaque beneath the roses had darkened with age, but its words still gleamed in the sun. In truth, there is peace. Sometimes visitors left small stones or flowers beneath it. Some said prayers, others simply stood in silence. Margaret knew none of their names, but she felt connected to them all, bound by the quiet understanding that every life carries something buried and that every heart, sooner or later, must dig to find its light. One afternoon, Pastor Lewis visited her home again. He was older now, his shoulders more stooped, his steps slower, yet his smile was unchanged. They sat on the porch together, drinking tea and watching the wind move through the fields. He told her that the story of Daniel and Edward had become part of the church's teaching, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a lesson in redemption. Young couples came to hear it before their weddings. Widows found strength in it after funerals, and even the restless youth who passed through the town spoke of it with quiet awe. Margaret listened and nodded. She said little, for she had no need to add to what was already complete. Her heart, once restless with questions, now knew only stillness. When the pastor stood to leave, he looked out over the fields and said softly, "You gave peace to more people than you'll ever know." She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the afternoon. "The truth gave it," she said. "I only stopped hiding from it." When he left, she stood on the porch for a long while, watching the sun lower behind the hills. The air was cool and smelled faintly of hay and smoke from distant chimneys. The light touched the edges of the world with a kind of tenderness she could feel deep inside her. She thought again of the box she had unearthed all those years ago, how heavy it had felt in her hands, how cold the metal had been, how her heart had trembled when she first read Daniel's name. That moment had changed everything, and yet, standing here now, she could not imagine her life without it. It had led her to truth, to forgiveness, to peace. That evening, she lit the oil lamp on the mantel. The flame burned with a quiet strength, illuminating the photographs and the wooden carving that had become her altar of memory. The two men's faces, once burdened by pain, now seemed to look at each other through the years, their story resting in the stillness between them. The carving of their joined hands sat beneath them, its surface smooth and gleaming in the light. Margaret sat down in her chair and opened her journal one last time. On the final page, she wrote slowly, her hands steady despite her age. "Truth came to me as something I feared. I thought it would destroy what I loved. But truth is not destruction. It is light. It showed me what love really was. Not perfect, but patient. Not loud, but lasting. It stayed when everything else fell silent." She closed the journal and placed it beside the lamp. The flame flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the wind rose softly through the trees, carrying the faint sound of crickets from the field. She leaned back, her eyes following the shadows on the ceiling as they moved gently with the light. The air was warm, her breath even. Through the open window came the smell of rain beginning somewhere far away, the promise of another storm, the rhythm of renewal. She thought of Daniel one last time, not as absence, but as presence. The man he had been and the peace he had found had both lived on in her. There was nothing left unspoken, nothing left undone. The clock on the wall marked the passing minutes with quiet certainty. Each tick felt softer than the one before. The night deepened, and the world outside her window turned silver beneath the moonlight. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered her final prayer, a simple one, shaped by a lifetime of faith. "Thank you for truth. Thank you for love. Thank you for peace." The house around her seemed to breathe in unison, holding her words in its quiet walls. And as the wind carried the sound of rain closer to the valley, everything, the fields, the trees, the river, the home, rested together in the same unbroken silence, where truth had found its peace and peace had finally found her.